So again, welcome to you all and welcome to week 3 in Triple M132, and thank you all for being here today. This week, our topic is about organisational environments, and also that includes the organisational culture, and that's covered in chapter 4 of your textbook. And when we talk about environments, there are 3 environments that an organisation has to monitor. So there's those 2 that are external or outside of the organisation, and there's also what's going on inside the organisation, so that internal environment. And in week 1, we talked about theories, and one of those theories is systems theory. And so that theory tries to connect all of these theories, or all of these environments, I should say, all together. And when we talk about this topic, one of the overarching messages is that environments drive what managers do. So managers really have to be aware of what's going on around them. So I'm just providing a little bit of background here before we launch into today's topic. So they've got to be aware of what's going on. And, you know, if they were managing a monopoly, for example, if you're in charge of a monopoly, you can really do whatever you want because you're not subject to the same market to the same extent. But we realise that very few companies are monopolies. And so when there is competition, and the more competition that exists for a company, then the more that the management have to be aware of changes and the effects of those changes that are going on outside of the organisation in that external environment, because that's going to influence the success of their organisation. So managers also need to be aware of not only what's going on outside their organisation, they have to also keep an eye on and monitor what's going on inside the organisation. And so that's they do that by managing the culture. So, and by managing the culture, they can really build a strong competitive advantage through its people, which are, of course, as you know, one of the great resources that a company has. So that provides just a little bit of background for what we're looking at today. But as we've done in previous weeks, we'll get started by first doing our acknowledgement of country. And as you know, we have a different focus each week. And just to highlight how our businesses in our communities see the recognition of First Nations people as being very important now. And this is also an example of a force that's happening in the external environment. So progressive managers are recognising the voice of Indigenous people and are beginning to acknowledge that. And that's why we are also doing it in our unit. And in the picture here, you can see this. Here are some AFLW players and having a women's competition in the Australian football. That's another example of a socio-cultural environmental change. And in the first game of each season, the teams wear their own Indigenous guernsey. And Deakin, our university, supports the Geelong team. And here they're wearing a wearing a guernsey designed by Corinna Eccles. So let's read this. As we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging of all the land we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. Okay, so here are our learning outcomes for this week. So there are 6 for this week, chapter 4, and these are really the signposts that can direct you to the kinds of things that we want you to think about as you read through the chapter this week. So it's kind of a bit of a guide, a strategic guide as to what to focus on in your revision and reading. Now, again, just by way of another introduction to this week's topic, it's important to note that there's a connection between a company's strategy, its structure, and also its culture. So when we look at a company's strategy, that's really about what they're going to do or the direction that they're going in. And for many years, the strategy was seen as the main priority guiding what companies do. And the thinking behind that was that if we get the strategy right, then everything else will fall into place. But the structure is also important, and that's really about how the company organises themselves and puts their resources together so that they can achieve that strategy. So the planning around actioning that strategy is also important through that structure. But also important is that culture. And that culture is really the way that a company believes its people should work together to achieve the strategy. And you've got to have a culture that supports the strategy and structure, because if you've got people in the organisation that are working for you that don't believe in the strategy, or maybe don't even care about the strategy, then they're not going to work towards that strategic goal. So managing the culture is really key to making sure that you are effectively achieving your strategy. So the connection between the three is really important. And there's a link to a very short video at the bottom of that slide that you might want to have a look at after the lecture. So now we'll have a look at how organisations have to understand and fit into their external environment. And organisations operate in different external environments. And as we just mentioned, they need to structure themselves so that they can deal with any challenges, but also to make sure that they're in a really good position to make the most of any opportunities. And so before we talk too much in detail about these different elements, one thing to note, and if you've got some experience of maybe studying business management in VCE, you might be aware that different textbooks call these different forces and environments by different terms. And, you might be familiar with PESTEL, which is shown at the bottom of the screen there. So that those letters represent the different categories in the external environment. So things like the political factors, E stands for economic factors. You've got the sociocultural factors, technological factors, environmental and legal. Our textbook looks at the 5 forces that are listed in, shown in that image there, because it puts the government or the political and the legal components in together. But other textbooks, they might leave out the natural disasters component. So there is some variation, but the main thing to note is that the basic elements are the same, but how they are put together can be done in different ways. But in MMM 132, in our unit, we look at our textbook, and that lists those 5 forces. So moving on, what are these about? Well, these are the things that happen in the external environment in which organisations are operating. And as we said, there are 2 external environments, and the first one is the macro or general environment, and that's what we're looking at right now. But the other one, which we'll look at in a moment, is the micro or specific environment. But when we're looking at the macro environment, these are really those general things that are across the whole of society, and they will affect many businesses and many organisations as they make their plans. And so the key here is to think about it as applying to many companies and many industries, whereas the micro environment affects a particular industry or players within an industry. But it's just really important overall for managers to be aware of what's going on in those macro and micro environments, and to consider how those environmental factors might affect what they're doing in their organisation. Now, here's an example to show how one thing happening in the world can have an impact in other parts of the world. And of course, that's the effect of war. And so one impact of the war between Russia and Ukraine has been the price of crude oil jumping 15%. And of course, that will affect everybody in every country. And then there's the impact too of the supply and price of wheat. So as you can see here, Russia and Ukraine provide 29% of the world's supply of wheat. And so the war is going to affect the price of that commodity and also in turn any products that come from wheat. And so, and also other products there, we've got high volumes of sunflower oil, gas and fertilizer from these countries too. So this is an example of how war can have a huge effect on businesses around the world. And this is the kind of thing that if you're a manager of a company, you'd need to be aware of in your macro environment. And this example, this comes from March last year, and this was just at the beginning or the early stages of that war. And as we just saw there, Ukraine and Russia are some of the biggest suppliers of wheat in the world. And this example is showing how that had a flow-on effect to products and commodities made with wheat, and in this case it's the instant noodles. And so the price of these noodles rose significantly as a result. So if you were running a noodle business, you're the manager, you'd be having talks then with your suppliers about how are you going to source wheat, what are the costs, how reliable is the supply, and will that last in the short term or longer term? And last year, Indonesia, it imported about a quarter of its wheat from the Ukraine to make its instant noodles. And so this, as we can see, this war is having a big impact on the world's economy and its ability to feed many people. And of course, as we know, the people in Ukraine as well. But this is just some examples to show how an event like war can have impacts on businesses worldwide. So just to reiterate, the factors in the macro environment indirectly affect all organisations. And again, we'll look at some examples that you can see here. So the first one there is technology, and the NBN is very important, and another is battery power. And this technology that's affected car manufacturing, whether you're building houses, heating systems, smartphones. So those technological advances in batteries are affecting many players or organisations in an economy. And we've got the use of drones too. That's another example being used in many different industries, real estate surveying to the delivery of different goods. And you've also got the economy, and bit eager there with the slides. And here we've got the example of the stock market and interest rates. And as we know, that's affecting everybody at the moment. And in relation to the third one there, the socio-cultural trends, things like the age of your workforce, the size of your retired workforce, and so on. These are all relevant. LGBTIQ+, healthy lifestyle issues, and the environmental movement. These are all examples as well. The circular economy. Again, it's becoming more important for organisations and a lot more social pressure for companies to go green. In the political and legal area, as we saw, there are examples of wars, the lockdowns that we all want to forget, but that was also a political and legal aspect, and that affected everybody. And of course, we've got the natural and human-caused disasters, which pretty much seem to be happening way too frequently. Things like rising sea levels, the extreme heat that's happening in Europe at the moment, bushfires, and so on. So all of these things affect the way that companies are managed, and managers need to be aware of these bigger issues in that general macro environment, because they're going to indirectly affect them in one way or another. So they might not be an oil company, but the price of oil will certainly affect what they do. Now, let's have a look at another example. And this is something else to consider, and this is one of the socio-cultural trends. And this is, of course, a map of the world, and the colours on the map represent the ages of the population, the median age of the population. So the darker the colours on the map, the older the population, whereas the lighter they are, then the population is the median age is much younger. So in the chat box, if you let us know, or if you're in aged care, if you want to invest in aged care, what countries might you do some research on, or perhaps invest in if you wanted to invest in aged care? Maybe set up a retirement home or goods. Italy, great. Yes. Germany, Japan, great. So yeah, so it makes sense. You'd look at that and say, okay, where's my market? And that's a great place to invest in because of the median age, much older population. But school products. So where would you be looking to go for school products? So that's suited a much younger demographic. Which country was Africa? Great. Yeah, so Africa has a much younger population and even some, yeah, great. Paraguay, Mexico. Your geography is impressive. And so that's right. So India, yep. So that's right. So the median age is something like 23 or 24 in India. So if you're selling products that are aimed at that market, you'd want to see where that market is and where that market is going in the future too. So, so this is just highlighting how sociocultural trends affect what companies do and don't do, and that can also influence some of their investment and planning decisions. And this is just a quick word cloud of other examples in that macro environment. So, you know, things like recession, trade barriers, pollution, the Me Too movement, immigration, and so on. So these all have an influence on organisations and industries to various extents. Okay, so next area we're going to have a look at is in the micro. Still looking at the external environment, but this is the micro environment. So another term is looking at the industry environment. So and sometimes we also call this the specific environment because it's specific to what a particular industry does. So these examples that we'll go through, these all share more or less the same customers, competitors, suppliers, industry regulators, and also advocacy groups. So you can see on the top left-hand side, I'll just click on all those ones there. So on the top left-hand side, you can see we've got the motor vehicle industry. So they all compete with each other for the same customers. They have the same advocacy groups, like here in Victoria, we have the RACV. They're competing against each other for the sellers, and they often have the same suppliers. So often they use the same inputs, the same airbags or braking systems, for examples. And below that are the banks, and they're also in the same specific environment. So they all have the same competitors. They usually have the same suppliers. And when we talk about suppliers, we can include labor. So if you're, really good at your job in the bank, if you were looking for another job, chances are you'd go to another bank if you wanted to move. So labour, when it relates to specialisation in an industry, is also part of that micro environment. And also at the bottom of the screen, there are some universities, and they all operate in the same industry environment. The regulation is the same across the universities, which is TEQSA, the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Assurance Regulators. So our industry is regulated just as the finance industry regulated. And we've also got there on the bottom right a map of restaurants in Box Hill. So their environment is a little bit smaller, but they are still in the same industry, doing the same things. They're still competing for the same customers and competing against the same people, still using the same input supplies. And they're also regulated by the same local government food safety body that looks at all those requirements there. So again, here we're looking at the external environment, but it's much more industry related. So it's not affecting everybody across the whole country. So let's look at this a little bit more now from a theoretical perspective. And this is looking at the characteristics of the changing environments. And as always, we start with a definition from the text, and that's so that we can all agree that we're talking about the same thing. So external environments are the forces and the events outside a company that have the potential to influence or affect it. And this is about one of the theories that we covered in week 1, that's systems theory. So organisations are in an external environmental system, and that external system has an effect on what they do. And when we talk about external environments, we also have to think about environmental uncertainty. And that's really, again, about how certain or uncertain the environment is, because obviously the more certain it is, then that can affect the decisions that a manager has to make. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you could apply this to yourself. your life is a lot easier if you know what's going on. If you don't know what's going on and you don't know perhaps where you're going to be living next week, or you don't know what income you're getting next month, then your life is going to be much harder. So one of the biggest issues in all organizations and all businesses is certainty or uncertainty. And of course, we know at the moment the war in Ukraine is making for a very complex environment. Inflation is affecting our financial institutions too. We've got rising interest rates. So basically, the more certain managers are about the environment, then the better that they can make decisions. So let's look at this a bit more detail. So environmental certainty and uncertainty is a combination of, first of all, environmental change. And so when we look at this, we're asking, how fast are things changing? Is the change quick or is it slow? Are we in a stable environment or is it very dynamic where the rate of change is very fast? Or is it punctuated? So that means that there's been a big change, then things settle down for a little while until there's another big change. The other issue to consider is how complicated or complex that external environment is. So if we were a restaurant, the external environment might be as complex as finding somewhere to rent your restaurant and maybe sourcing the food and the staff. So overall, it's fairly simple. But if you're operating a large multinational organization, then the complexity is much greater. And particularly if your input products are hard to find or if your markets are very specialized. So Deakin University, we're operating in a very complex environment. The university is involved in research. They teach and have students, including international students. So it's a very complex set of factors that are influencing the university that's much more complex than, say, running a restaurant. And the third issue is resource availability. So are the resources abundant or are they rare? So, for example, if there's a problem with crops like coffee in Brazil, then that's going to raise the prices, and it will be a bigger problem for cafes and for markets that provide coffee and coffee services because they've got to try and work with the resource availability. And this also relates back to our noodle example and the wheat supply. So if you're a noodle company, those wheat products are a bit more scarce. So these three factors, they all work together to create and influence the degree of certainty and uncertainty. So the thing here is, to be aware of the effect of what's happening outside the organisation. It's very important for those who are managing inside the organisations and the types of decisions that they've got to make. And just to showcase this in another way, in this sort of table here, you can see on the left, on the y-axis, that shows the environmental uncertainty. So should you be hiring more people or should you be laying them off? Should you be fixing interest rates now or maybe buying your energy in a futures market? So these are all much harder decisions to make. The higher the uncertainty, the more challenging the environment is for managers, as we've said. And again, it's much more harder to manage. But on the x-axis, on the other hand, this is about predictability. So can we predict what's going to happen next week or next year? So this is less subject to change. Things aren't so scarce. So obviously, the more predictable it is, the easier it is to manage. And whereas the more complex and more uncertain, then it's much more difficult. And again, if we think about, during the lockdown, think about, for example, Qantas, during the lockdowns, they had little to no idea about the future. They could only make their best guesses based on scenarios and maybe predictions because of all those border closures. Whereas if we look, 4 to 5 years ago, it was a lot easier for Qantas, and all they had to do really was, in order to increase their market, they just had to improve their service. So things can change. And again, the less predictable the environment is and the more complex, the harder it is to manage. And that has, of course, naturally a huge impact on strategy and the decisions that managers need to make. Here's another issue, and this relates to again, in environmental certainty and uncertainty. And in this case, it's looking at climate change. And the previous government, a big criticism of what they did was about their lack of action on climate change. So they didn't really have a very strong policy. And, businesses were saying, look, just can you give us a policy? And that way we've got something to work with and we can do some planning. So the businesses wanted certainty so they could maybe put in some investments and have a plan for the next 5 years about how they could, have more sustainable practices. So again, this, think about things like solar power or hydro or wind power. So businesses look to the government and, ask, well, what is your policy on renewables? And once they know, then they can start planning and take some steps to achieve that. But also something to be aware of too, within these sorts of government regulations, there can be some contradictions. While some governments are trying to support consumers moving towards cleaner transport, like electric vehicles, the Victorian government has an electric vehicle tax. So there can be some conflict amongst the policies and even amongst some governments, and there can be some over-regulation just as much as under-regulation in these sorts of matters. But the point is that this kind of regulation impacts certainty and the complexity of the environment, and therefore the decisions that managers need to make as a result. And if we look now at the two extremes of organisational design and how organisations are structured next, so this can be in response to their environment, how organisations structure themselves. And there are these two extremes, but in reality, most companies fall somewhere in between, but one more than the other, if you like. So the first one, and as a general rule two, we should say that larger companies tend to be more mechanistic, whereas smaller companies tend to be more organic. So they're the two extremes in terms of the organisational designs. So if we go through them first, we'll look at mechanistic organisations first. And one way to think of this is that they're set up similar to a machine. So it operates with parts that they all connect to each other, the larger parts with the smaller parts, and there are quite clear-cut rules as to how they all connect together. And these mechanistic types of organisations, they're really suitable for more stable, low uncertainty environments and slower changing environments. And they tend to be, as I said, bigger organisations that have a lot of rules. They will have a top-down hierarchy and a much narrower span of control. So if you're working there, you know who your manager is, and the managers know exactly who they're controlling. The workers have very specialised tasks. There are formal rules. There's that vertical communication channel structure, and there's very much structured decision-making too. An example, Deakin University. We are a large organisation. It's very mechanistic. We operate under a lot of rules. There are a lot of policies. It's a very big university. Other examples of mechanistic structures would be banks and government departments like Centrelink. These are, again, they have a lot of rules about how things work and a lot of very specialised tasks within it. And as a result, not so much flexibility. And that's where, in contrast, we've got those organic companies. So they're very good in unstable and uncertain environments because they're less rigid and they are a lot more flexible. So they have less rules. They have two-way communication. Their employees, in other words, they work in teams, they collaborate, they talk to each other, and they operate in smaller groups. So again, the types of tasks they'll do, they're more generalised, they have a wider span of control. And so this way the managers can influence many groups and many people because a lot of them are self-managing and it's a lot more free-flowing. And so again, this type of organization, it's more suited to certain companies than others. So perhaps a more creative company. But again, it's the structure is reflective of the type of environment that they're working in on generally. So just something to think about there for the different organizational structures, and we'll be revisiting this in future weeks too. Now, again, when we're focusing on the mechanistic type of structure, and again, this is where we can look at how they can divide the workers to complete those organizational goals. So again, how they complete their tasks within that sort of structure. And so we can look at departmentalization is one way that organizations can do that, or divisions, how they subdivide their work and workers to complete those particular tasks. So if we go through these and just explain it a little bit further. So again, the first type of structure that mechanistic organizations can set up is that have that functional departments. And so this is where you've got the experts in the same field are working together because they are specialists. And again, this is much more frequent in larger organizations. So you can see here, we've got the HR manager, we've got the accounting manager, the marketing manager, and so on. And when you want people doing accounting together, so one accountant helping another accountant to do a good job, you can put them in the same accounting department. And that way they can inform each other, they can train each other, and they become experts in their field. So that's lots of positives about that. But a downside can be that they often don't know or understand or maybe even appreciate what other people are doing in other departments. So, you know, if you've got the human resource people and the accountants, they might not understand, you know, the human resource person might not fully understand what's important in terms of the finances or the budget. So they've got to find a way to communicate with them. But the everyday decisions in human resources will be very much based in HR policies rather than the financial type of decision making. And vice versa with the accountants. They might not be so focused on the HR side of things because they're really focusing on what's going on in their particular department. Now, another way of organising the workers and work tasks is by division, and this could be done by either products or by customers. So rather than putting people together based on their expert skills like the accountants or the HR people, which is functional, instead you put them together based on the product or who the customers are that they're responding to. So an example might be if you're running a large department store like Myers, you'd have people in the shoe department and other people in the electrical appliances department, because you've got experts in selling shoes and experts in selling appliances. So people are organised together based on the product. And the best everyday example, I guess, we can see of customer division is with the banks. So banks will have their business clients and customers, and then there's the branches that work with customers that have their personal banking needs. So again, so just a different way to sort of subdivide that work. And the third one there is based on geography. So the example here is for a large multinational with departments in North America, Europe, the Middle East, and the Asia Pacific division. And if we're talking about, say, the Bank of Melbourne, those departments could just be branches around Victoria, but the division is geographically determined and not based on product or customer. Then we've got at number 4, the matrix departmentalization or the matrix structure. So this is where you've got an organisation that has maybe 2 or more versions of departmentalization, and that's what you'd call a matrix. And that's what we've got at Deakin. So we've got the functional experts. So, you know, we've got those accounting managers, we've got the marketing managers who are mostly in head office. And that's a common thing in big organisations. But at Deakin, we've also got the departments, or in this case, the faculties, and they're the operating groups, and they're quite expert in their own area. And so they And within those faculties, they might have their own HR human resources people who are connected to the human resources head office people. So large organisations do tend to have that matrix system, which is a little bit of both, with the functional structure, which is usually happening at that head office. And number 5 is the networked team. And this is a more modern view where people are connected by way of the information rather than their particular job role. And technology helps to facilitate that kind of network of who we know and what we do and who we connect with, so that we can work in a team. And the team might have a certain function, but they have a whole series of connections of people within and also outside of their organisation. And of course, you know, we use technology, we use Teams meetings, we can email each other, we're using Zoom right now, and so on. And of course, as that technology grows, the functional systems, the divisional teams, they'll still be there, but they'll be a lot looser than what they used to be in the past, because that technology really helps to facilitate communication, and that can end up being a virtual structure, which is number 6. So a virtual structure is where organisations are part of a virtual network. So this is where companies say they will share skills and costs and capabilities amongst themselves. And maybe you might know someone who, or maybe it's you yourself, you know, who run a business from your computer at home. So you're not actually doing anything other than connecting or maybe designing, manufacturing, productions, logistics, and selling to customers. You're not storing anything. You might not even produce anything, but you're controlling all the network of connections, and that's your business and your area of expertise. So this virtual structure, this is growing, as we all know, with shopping online and producing online and so on. And we should say that none of these is better than the other. They've both got pros and cons. They've all got pros and cons, I should say. But it's just, and they relate to their prime focus of activity, the speed of which they do decisions. Maybe there's some duplication of work as well. And as we mentioned there, the danger of not being aware of what's going on in other departments. And that's just a little bit of our critical thinking. So this just highlights some of the evolution of those organisational structural changes. So it starts with that functional structure. So that's where you've got all the experts together. And that dominated right up until the late 1970s. And this is where organisations were mostly mechanistic, self-contained. They were very hierarchical, and you know, you've got all those functional experts, as I said, in working in different departments, such as in banks and big companies. So then that moved to the geographic structures in the 60s to 80s, and also just muting people, and just then as in the 1980s, the environment changed a lot, and the environment changed from, you know, that more simple, stable, certain environment to one that was very complex and dynamic. So it was changing a lot. So organizations had to adapt to that and move to that matrix structure. And that's where there's that combination of the central headquarters, if you like, and those substructures. And then you've got that vertical team structure with centralization, and then moving to where we are going now, which is that virtual structure. So this is just showing that structures within organizations have changed over time, and what's helped with that evolution is the availability of technology, and also again being mindful of what organizations are doing and what they're trying to achieve. So now we've been discussing the external environment, and now we'll have a look at the internal environment of the organisation. And this is looking at it in terms of systems. So we can break that down further into the formal and informal subsystems of an organisation. And so the formal systems, subsystems there consist of that internal leadership strategy, the marketing, operations, the technology, and so on, just to name a few. And importantly, we've got the informal subsystems. So that's, and we'll be talking about that in more detail in a moment. And this is really that, well, this is really based on the culture of the organisation, the relationships between people, things like politics and the leadership style within that organisation. So these are the way that things happen inside and within the organisation. Now, looking at some of the theory around this, this is the McKinsey 7S model. And what McKinsey was looking at was how you can change what's happening inside organizations. And this shows how change leaders can effectively manage change by having strategies about what's going on inside the firm and by focusing on the interactions of different elements like the structure, which is what we talked about just now, as well as things like the systems, the style, the staff, the skills and strategy of the organisation. So all of these revolve around and they're interconnected with those shared values. In other words, thank you. We'll just thank you for muting yourself. So they're all interconnected with those shared values. In other words, the culture of an organisation. Now, here we're talking about organisations. But, you know, you'll know yourself, your family will have a set of shared values about what's important in your life. And it's those values that really drive how you behave and what's important to you. So if you put all this together, we've got the internal and the external environment. So if we combine these things. Thank you. So we've got, again, how do we manage the external environment? So in the top left-hand corner there, managers will do a SWOT analysis. So they'd look at the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities and threats that could potentially impact their organisation. And we know that these are constantly shifting, they're dynamic. And the more that things change, we know that the more difficult it is to manage. And one big threat that we referred to earlier was that's impacting many companies is the war. But a weakness within many companies at the moment is getting good workers, being able to find good staff, having good people stay with you and not leave. And again, if you're looking for a job, managers need to be aware of this, and in turn that will affect their strategies. And of course, there's the internal organisation there at the bottom left. So things like the leadership style, the skills and expertise there, the history of performance, that's all part of what's going on there. And managers then take that and make their strategy, which leads to their vision, mission and values. And again, we'll be talking more about that in week 5. And that then leads to the operational goals and strategies, how they're going to create their competitive advantage and design the organisation. What is their structure? What is the understanding of efficiency and effectiveness? Their HR policies. And again, what type of culture are they going to try and influence? Who are their alliances, their production systems? And then they would measure those outcomes. How effective are they? And they'd look at their effectiveness in terms of the finance, the social policies, the political policies, ethical policies, and that would feed back again into influencing their strategy. So you can see those arrows connecting all those different components together. So now we'll talk about organisational cultures, and the competing values framework helps us to understand what this is. Now, culture in simple terms is really best understood as the way that we do things around here. And it's the values, beliefs and attitudes shared by organisational members. So that's kind of our definition, our starting point. And, you know, if we think about this at a simple level, you know, you would have visited a friend's house, maybe gone there for a dinner and sat down with a family and thought, you know, these people do things a little bit differently than the way my family does things. And that's because you're in a different family culture. And culture is all about rules and regulations. It includes things like the history and celebrations, but it really all ends up being about the way that we do things around here. And this is why culture is so important. And of course, if you've traveled to another country, you'll be aware that national culture is very different, religious cultures are different, and so too are organizational cultures. And that's why you can go into a McDonald's or fast food type outlet and the staff seem to be having a really good time. You're really enjoying, being a customer there. But then you go into another fast food restaurant and the mood's completely different. And you might find that the staff are a bit grumpy. They're not really, and you don't really enjoy your experience in that second restaurant. And that really relates to the culture of that organization and also that particular workplace. And often that's driven by the leader or the manager there. So here, though, we're looking at culture only in organizations, but that notion of culture is the same everywhere. So looking at the competing values framework, this looks at 4 different kinds of cultures in organizations, but the main gist of it is whether or not the organization's culture is externally or internally orientated. So if we look at the one on the bottom right, the market one, this is in the grey there. So this is really about if you've got a culture that really focuses on what's happening outside the firm. So that's external forces, and it wants stability and control. And then, that's very much a market kind of culture. And that market culture will in turn drive that stability and control. So it will be very results orientated. It will have a competitive achievement focus. It will get the job done, which might be great in some companies. And that's, particularly important. Again, dependent on the type of organization and the purpose of that organization. So for example, if it's a finance organization, it's a very competitive environment. But in an aged care home, it might not be the right way to manage. So in an aged care home, you might want something that's a little bit more flexible, a little bit more internally focused, and a more feeling of family, nurturing, having everybody participate and be involved. So that more, the one that's opposite the marker one, the clan type of framework there. So the culture will be very much based on each organization and what is influencing that organization, the degree of flexibility, its focus, whether it's internal or external, and whether that management is looking for stability and control, or do they want more flexibility? So all of these sorts of things will influence the kind of culture that is going on inside the firm. But it is really important that managers are aware that culture really drives the way that things are done around the organisation, and that's why managers do have to manage culture very carefully. But it's a hard thing to do because, again, you're managing people and the way that they interact, the way that they feel, the way they do things, and their level of commitment. But what we do know from research is that organisational culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And basically, in other words, this is saying that no matter how good your strategy is, if the culture and the people within that company don't believe it and aren't prepared to support it, you as management will find it very, very difficult to achieve your strategy. So this tells us that management needs to work not only on the strategy side of things, but it also has to work with the people and to build their relationships. And if you remember way back in week 1, our definition of management is getting things done with and through people. So it's through this culture or organizational behavior that we can work on achieving the strategy of the organization. And that helps us to, get things done and accomplish our goals. So if you can have a positive culture and get your staff on board and make them feel like they're part of the organization, and you've done everything you can to influence a positive culture, like having clear values and vision and mission statements, then you're going to have more success as an organization. And that's better than just having policies for growth, change, performance, innovation, and execution. So those policies, they're good, but they need to be supported by a positive culture. And that culture will then support the values of the organisation. And that's really important. And that's why managers need to manage culture. Now, looking deeper into this, what people see, what people hear, and what they believe, these are the really important elements to having a successful organizational culture. However, it's really hard to see culture because it's not an obvious thing. It's not even a physical thing. It's quite intangible. So there are those surface level aspects of culture, like the symbolic things, the artifacts, things like the way people dress or the way that people behave towards each other. But there's also the other aspect about culture, which is what people hear or what people say. What do they say behind the scenes? Are people complaining? How are decisions made? And are they explained clearly? Are people speaking nicely to each other? Is there a bit of laughter happening? Or is everybody very quiet? So these are some things that you can sort of get a bit of an understanding about what the type of culture that's there. It's also about what people believe. So things like the widely shared beliefs and assumptions that people have about the organisation. Is this a great place to work, or is this a horrible place to work? Should you stay there? So these are all those deeply buried beliefs that are below the surface. They're very deep and they're rarely discussed or rarely thought about. It's just the way that things are, and nobody can really put their finger on it or really clearly see how things work. And that's very hard for managers who are highly committed to the goals of the organisation and are highly paid to achieve those goals. So it's very hard for them to know what's happening at ground level where the workers are. But again, having a focus on the policy, the practices and procedures, but also being aware of what people believe and assume about the company and their roles in the company is really important to getting things done. And another way of looking at that is the iceberg analogy. And this can be applied to organizational culture. So it shows us what's real, really visible and easily seen, but also what's underneath that surface and much harder to see. So you can see at the top there, we've got that organizational strategy. You can see the vision of the company. The goals are also written out. And these are usually quite clear visible on the website. But the structures and policies aren't as easy to see in an organization. Even if you're an employee, it's not always easy to see. And if we're trying to change what's happening in organizations, as you can see here, we can't just only change what's on top of the water, what's seen. We can't just change the strategy or the list of values or the vision. We've got to go deeper below that surface. And that's where, we're looking at things like what people really believe about their organization. What are those shared assumptions, the procedures, the traditions? What do they value? And things like, organizations doing a pulse survey, that helps to try and understand those elements a little bit more. But these are often unwritten and unseen, and as a result, much harder to influence. And if you're a manager, much harder to change. And here's some research that was collected over a couple of years up to 2020. And the data is based on over 40,000 employees from over 100 companies, big companies, and it just shows some of the indicators impacting workplace culture. So they've divided that into two parts: what impacts the organisation and its success, and then what impacts people and the way they feel about the organisation. And so together, these two components make up culture, that organisational perspective, and then it's the people's perspective within that organisation. So on the left-hand side there, you can see some of the statistics. 38% of employees believe they work in an organisation with an us versus them environment. And that's the greatest source of conflict, and that's called in and out group dynamics. Are you in the in group or are you in the out group? And they are in many organisations, but nearly 4 out of 10 people don't feel like they belong. Now, these groups can change depending on who's appointed to various roles, but that can, of course, have a big effect on how people feel. If they feel like they belong to an organisation, that might affect how empathetic they are, how respectful they are, and so on. Another one on the right-hand side, these are the people side of culture in an organisation. And 32% of employees strongly agree that they can be their authentic selves at work. So People are very happy if they can be themselves, which means that they're prepared to get on with their job. So, they don't have to waste a lot of time or energy being someone else, or perhaps, wearing a mask, if you like, or trying to match or compete with stereotypes that people have about how they should be behaving. And this has led to a conversation about unconscious bias. And if we think about, if 32% of employees strongly agree that they can be their authentic selves, that leaves a high proportion of people who feel like they can't be their authentic selves, and that's problematic. So with these, again, while we know that culture eats everything else for lunch, we also know that many managers aren't overly great at managing culture. And so I certainly hope that you are all working, if you are working, that you're working in a good workplace culture that values you. So that brings us to the end of our lecture today. I've gone a little bit over time as usual, so I do apologise again. But looking ahead, the seminars this week will be looking at the assessment again and looking in more detail about what's required for each of those tasks. And in particular, this week's topic is on the environments of the organisation, as we've been discussing. Keep up to date with your readings and note-taking of the textbook. This week it is chapter 4, but you can also preview chapter 5 for next week. Start working on your assignment 1.1, and of course bring any questions that you have about that to your seminars, or you can also post them on the discussion forum. And have a great week, everyone. So that's all for now. I'll stop the recording. Thanks for being here.